about the way in which the new framework or the new curriculum is essentially repurposing the means and ends in education. The one comment I hear most frequently that I think is, on the one hand, understandable, but on the other hand, I don't think it's what's happening, is that when we started to see the new framework, when we started to see the move toward core competencies or curricular competencies, there was an initial gut reaction to it that content was being dismissed. That we were, in some respects, I've seen comments where people say, well, we're tossing out content. Which, for me, I don't read it that way, and I've never seen it that way. And it might be a repurposing of knowledge and a repurposing of content and going deeper, but the basic fundamental premise is this. In order to think critically, you have to think critically about something. And that something is the content. So the idea that we are going to think critically in the abstract is somewhat silly because there has to be some meat on the bone, if you will. There has to be some substance to it. So I want to share with you a couple of things in this segment and then get you to talk about maybe the ways that you've approached the new framework, but also to think about some new ideas. Just as a preview, for me, and again, this is one person's perspective on how I would approach this in a school or a district, but if it were me, I would put a laser-like focus on the curricular competencies. The curricular competencies are simply the core competencies contextualized. The core competencies are like an umbrella. Within that, we need substance. And the curricular competencies allow us to take the core competency, critical thinking, and contextualize it in science, in language arts, in all of our subject areas, in math, etc. So the means and end switching places also is this idea that we are not starting from scratch. Now, we know that things have changed, right? And things are continuing to change, and we need to be keenly aware of that. But it doesn't mean that everything that you are doing in your school, your classroom, your district, et cetera, needs to be tossed away for something that is brand new. What we need to think about is the way in which this has unfolded. And this concept, to be honest, this concept that I'm about to share with you started on a scrap piece of paper in my office in School District 67, because as we were starting to talk about 21st century learning, we were thinking about how are we going to communicate this in a way that is, I think, accessible. So one of the things that I thought about as we were thinking about the competencies was the fact that many teachers that I spoke with at the time were saying, this is not new. Like when you think about how many of you put kids into groups in the 90s, right? So collaboration as a 21st century skill, that doesn't really make sense. Hey, Tom, we had kids do critical thinking in the 90s. Yes, we did. But as I reflected on those comments, as I interacted with teachers in our district and somewhat on a limited basis, but around the province, I started to think about what it is we used to do. And I thought about my own sort of background, and I thought about what did I do as a high school history teacher? What did I do as a social studies teacher? At times I taught middle school math, et cetera. What we used to do was we used to use these skills and dispositions as a means to an end. So for example, this is my own autobiography, when I put kids into groups, the sole purpose of putting them into a group was to produce a group project, and that project was really focused on content acquisition. So collaboration was a means to an end. Collaboration was, I put them into groups. When I reflect back, I realized that what I was not doing at the time was teaching my students that they were learning how to collaborate. So what I did not do was teach them how to develop roles and responsibilities. What I did not do was teach them how to come to consensus. What I did not do was teach them how to have conversations about contentious issues. I did not teach them how to resolve conflict. I said, you four are going to produce a diorama, period. And it was all about the content. So we've done this before. So here's the hidden good news for all of us across this province. The seeds of the curricular or core competencies are already planted in your classrooms because you're already doing this. When you think about how many of you across your classrooms and in your schools already have kids analyze, synthesize, hypothesize, infer. All of those skills are critical thinking skills. Critical thinking is not an abstract. It is a set of skills and dispositions that allow me to be a critical thinker and ultimately to become dispositionally a critical thinker. That is my dispositional default. The difference now, and again, this is one person's view, I recognize that. When I think about what we're looking at now, we're talking about the means and ends switching places. So what we're now focused on here in the 21st century is no longer am I using a collaborative experience to have you acquire content. I'm going to use the content to teach you how to collaborate. I'm going to use content to teach you how to think critically. It's the means and ends switching places. So the good news is that you have a lot of this already happening in your classroom. To what degree it's happening and how consistent it's happening, that's a different question. But many of us have the seeds to this happening already in the classroom. The difference is now on what we want as an outcome. What we want as an outcome is for kids to think critically. This is one of the reasons why the core competencies, or the curricular competencies, if you will, this is why in much of the literature you'll see outside of BC, the competencies are often referred to as cross-curricular competencies, because the subject silos are broken down when your focus is the competency versus, so the means to an end. So again, what I want to emphasize is that many of you, if not all of you, are already doing some semblance of the competencies without really even having to work for it, because you're already doing it. It's been a natural part of your instructional flow ever since you started teaching. What you might need to do is increase the level of intentionality with which you're helping students be aware that they are learning. Because remember, if one of our goals is to help students self-assess on the core competencies, then they themselves have to know and be aware that they are learning how to be critical thinkers. And then they need to be able to give examples. If I say, I am a more effective critical thinker than I used to be, a fair question is, well, give me an example. Well, I can analyze. In fact, in science, I was able to analyze the results of an experiment and articulate a different position, et cetera. So the curricular competencies are the core competencies contextualized. So we're starting on second base, if you will. We have a lot of this happening in our classrooms already. So I think two things are true. One is, I don't believe content is being tossed aside. We might be repurposing knowledge, but we're not tossing it aside. And B, we are starting in a place of strength when it comes to a lot of these structures that we're already focused on. Now, let me give you an example of why this is important. When it comes to critical thinking, there are some conflicting positions even in the literature, in the academic world. There is the generalist view, and the generalist view would have critical thinking be an abstract concept, right? These are discrete skills that are easily transferable. There's a view of critical thinking that says that are easily transferable, and that you would simply have to learn these skills and then you'll use them in all of your different classes. At the end of the continuum, if you were a generalist, you would say what we need to do is create a new class called critical thinking. Now, the conflicting view is one of the specificist view, or the specialist view. The specificist view in the literature is one that says critical thinking is tied to specific subject areas, and that they are dependent on thinking about something. So these are conflicting views in the literature, that even to this day there is debate in the academic world about what is the proper lens through which we examine critical thinking. Now, of course, that leaves us in a little bit of a tough spot as schools, because what do? Which position do we take? So my colleagues and I would submit to you that the implications for us as a school is to take a balanced approach. So on the one hand, we can borrow something from the generalist approach, in that as a school, or even as a school district, et cetera, we can begin to articulate the core of what we believe critical thinking is. And we have that provincially to some degree, but even contextualizing it for different places around the province, because it's important that assessment is always context dependent and it is nuanced. At the same time, we take the specificist approach because we have to make sure that critical thinking is taught within the context of a subject. So I'm not advocating for a separate class, I'm just suggesting that that would be a generalist view. What I say is that we take a generalist view in the sense that we have a collective approach in our school to teaching critical thinking, but that we make sure that that collective approach is always contextualized within different subject areas so that you have that important thinking about something. There has to be substance behind it. Because we want to emphasize the application of critical thinking skills, and defining critical thinking, how we define critical thinking, is helpful because it brings a little bit of clarity to what can sometimes be an abstract concept, okay? So my point is that the repurposing of the means and ends, our focus on critical thinking, still requires content. It still requires knowledge. If I'm going to think deeply about something, I have to know something about that something. So I have to know things. So if we're taking the approach that we're tossing content aside, my perspective would be that would be an error because you have to have substance behind that. So we're still going to have that sort of mutually supportive, formative and summative approach. We still need to practice. We still need to get down to granular skills. We still need to be able to allow kids to be messy with their thinking without it always costing them in sort of the mark book or the grade book or the report card. So we still are always going to take a balanced approach in how we approach the new curriculum. So let me just sort of walk you through a few things when you look at the framework, and then I'm going to have another a pause and ponder for you to think about and talk about the new framework. So here you have an example of English language arts in grade 9. One of the first things that you'll notice is that on the right-hand side, there's content. So right away, even on the surface, if somebody were to say, well, content's being tossed aside, well, it's not, it's right there in the document. But the one thing I want you to notice about the right side, if you have not noticed this already, is while the content is listed there, there is no identified cognitive complexity. There is no indication as to what degree I'm supposed to know this content. It doesn't tell me, am I supposed to memorize it? Am I supposed to apply it? Am I supposed to innovate and create as a result of it? Am I supposed to critique it? What am I supposed to do with this content? There is no identified level of complexity. It simply lists topics, content, knowledge, etc. Where does the cognitive complexity come in? And when I say cognitive complexity, think of a couple of things. Think of Norman Webb's depth of knowledge framework, or think of Bloom's taxonomy. Those are two easy sort of frameworks to think about. The contextualization happens on the left side. Notice that when you read through the curricular competencies, you have the content being contextualized, and you have the sophistication or the cognitive complexity of the content on the left side. That is why I said earlier, I would put a laser-like focus on the curricular competencies as my outcome. Because if we accomplish the curricular competencies, you will by default, the core competencies are taking care of themselves because the curricular competencies are the core competencies contextualized. Critical thinking is not just an abstract concept. When you synthesize, so third bullet down, when you synthesize ideas from a variety of sources to build understanding, that's an example of thinking critically. So by putting our focus on the curricular competencies, again, I can't emphasize this enough, I think that's where teachers will be best served, because repeatedly coming back to those skills. Now, the best part about the curricular competencies is that they themselves are content neutral for the most part. So I keep going to the right side to bring in new content to keep coming back to the skills we're developing on the left side. And then when we finish that unit of study, we go back to the right side and, okay, what's next? Now we come back and we start thinking critically more deeply in a different area. Okay? So here's another example, right? Here's grade 10 science. Again, notice on the right side, you have potential and kinetic energy. To what degree? To what level of depth? To what level of complexity? How sophisticated is this supposed to be? That comes over here, right? Now we're talking about questioning and predicting. What are questioning and predicting? It's critical thinking. When we have a student who has a disposition of asking for clarification when they don't understand something, that is them demonstrating both the skill and the disposition of a critical thinker. So again, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to focus on the curricular competencies, because you will have to use content and information to give substance to the curricular competencies, which means you're repurposing knowledge. The curricular competencies are how you take the core competencies and contextualize them. So if you can begin to re-examine the framework, again, if you have not done so already, that's the way I would approach it. Again, I'm not here to tell people what to do, but that's the way, if I were doing this and rolling up my sleeves, this is the approach I would take, and I would build sort of the learning sequencing, the units, et cetera. I would focus them on the curricular competencies, use the content to fill in the substance as the curriculum, and use the competencies as the end result of trying to get. You can't think critically without knowing something about the topic. So looking at the framework through a fresh lens or a different lens will be, in some respects, and again, many of you out there, maybe you've already been doing it this way, and maybe you haven't. I don't know that. But I think that's the way I would approach it, again, putting the curricular competencies at the center. So I want to ask you 2 questions for the pause and ponder. The first one, and again, in your 10 minutes that you have, you can choose to focus on one or the other, or even within the same room, you could have people focusing on one question versus the other. It's up to you. The first question is, what steps have you already taken to repurpose content knowledge as a means to the competencies? So where have you already seen, both individually and collectively, where have you already seen the means and ends switching places? And 2, what steps could you take to further repurpose content knowledge as a means to the competencies? So if you're already doing it, maybe you just want to focus on what we could do next, or if you want to just focus on what you've done so far, you can do that, or you could focus on both of those. But whatever pathway you choose for this 10-minute conversation, we'll bring you back together in 10 minutes and do our third segment, okay? How have you seen the means and ends already switching places, okay? 10 minutes, we'll come back together.